Mr. Tidley, your work at Penn State covers a variety of issues, some of which you've spoken to. First of all, is there any doubt that the climate in the Arctic is warming and that there is going to be an opening of the sea channels?
Well, thank you, sir, for the question. I think there's extremely high confidence the Arctic will continue to warm, and the only question on a seasonally ice-free Arctic is not if, but when. Reasonable people can disagree. When I started the Navy's Task Force on Climate Change, the consensus was in the 2060s, 2050s, and 2060s. I was telling the Navy probably the 2035 or so. I would still say 2035, which is coming up very soon. By the time we get to 2020, that's going to be next decade. So we have 15-ish years to prepare for when we have seasonally ice-free Arctic. Now, it's going to freeze up in the winter, probably for everybody's life in here and our children's life. But over time, by the time we get to the latter part of the 21st century, we'll start seeing weeks and even months of ice-free conditions. And I think that's what the Russians and Chinese.
I wanted to get that on the record because that's foundational for everything that we've been talking about here. Also, you've spoken to Russia and to China. Why is China interested in the Arctic?
I think China is interested, well, first, Heather Conley down at the other end of the table here is really the expert on this. But as I understand China is looking at this primarily from an economic perspective. If you look at their Belt and Road Initiative, this really actually encircles Eurasia. And the so-called Polar Silk Road is the northern component of that encirclement. So I think they see this as if you put China as the hub of the late 21st century, early 22nd century world, they want to ensure they have resources. They also look at their fossil fuel resources. I'm sure you're aware that the Chinese are very concerned about the Strait of Malacca. They think the United States could interdict their supply of energy through the strait. Whereas if you're bringing it across the top of Russia, which is at least their friend for now, and through the Russian waters on the side of the Bering Strait, I believe if you're in Beijing, you see that as a more assured access along with landlines through Russia for energy.
Earlier today, I was at a meeting in which it was stated that the critical importance of being on the key committees. China is imposing itself on the Arctic Council, and as I understand it, seeking a position at the committee level, and therefore will be in a position to direct or to influence the decisions. Is that correct, Ms. Conley and Mr. Brigham? Dr. Brigham, jump in.
Yeah, no, I think the 8 Arctic states have control of the Arctic Council. There's no question about it. They have non-Arctic state observers like China and India, Italy, 13 non-Arctic states. And so they observe, they participate, but minimally. It really is the 8 Arctic states and the Arctic Council, which is a consensus body, intergovernmental forum with non-binding, generally, decisions. So it's a weaker body, but nonetheless focused on environmental protection, sustainable issues. China has a voice with other non-Arctic states, but I would argue not an overwhelming voice there. But they are at the table.
Mr. Kennedy, you jumped in, and Mr. Conley, you both kind of sat up in your chair when I raised that question.
Thank you. Just on the China's role in the Arctic Council, I think what we're seeing is a growing confidence since they became permanent observers in 2013. They're managing their way through the working groups. It is their funding and their scientific presence and activity. They're opening new scientific research centers in northern Iceland, their presence in Greenland. They believe they have a valid role. Their environment is impacted by the changes in the climate, although there's some scientific dispute whether mid-latitude countries are impacted, so they think they have a science presence, and the funding of indigenous groups and elsewhere are building that credibility and that voice. The Arctic Council has an observer's manual, well, they have to follow that procedure, but I would say their funding, their presence, their visibility, not unlike that we've seen in Antarctica with their growing science presence. Science is presence. Presence it ensures that sovereignty. Just to follow up with Admiral Titley, we have had a longstanding, in fact, Lawson came with us, a Track 2 dialogue with China's Arctic scholars for the last 3 years that looks at China's interests in the Arctic. I would absolutely say it's shipping, it's the diversity of those shipping routes, absolutely from the Straits of Malacca, but it shortens by up to 30% east-west transit for Chinese goods. It is absolutely an energy requirement, mineral resources, rare earths, which is why they're particularly interested in Greenland, potentially Iceland, and the mining capabilities, as well as the LNG and their participation in Yamal, the protein, the fishing stocks, which I think is an undervalued issue that Beijing is quite interested in, which is why they wanted that seat at the table to be part of that 5+5 dialogue that I mentioned to you. Tourism, believe it or not, you are going to continue to see a wave of Chinese tourism in the Arctic. We're already seeing that in Finland and elsewhere. Their commercial presence then allows their tourism presence to come. So it's going to be a comprehensive presence over time. They're investing the high-level diplomacy, the economic diplomacy, and then we know many of the commercial ventures that China produces has a PLA-PLN component to it. So we have to understand and research the strategic implications of what a greater Chinese infrastructure presence and science presence means to our interests. So for instance, if China builds an air base or an airstrip, airport, very close to Thule Air Force Base in Greenland, does that have strategic implications for the United States and our missile defense radar system? Does a growing surface-to-air missile presence on Wrangel Island in Russia, does that impact our missile defense architecture at Fort Greely, Alaska? Those are the types of questions we have to really start asking. That's the strategic look ahead that's been missing, in my view, in all of our Arctic documents that we've produced over the last several years.
I thought you were going to mention Djibouti rather than Iceland, but
I have nothing to add to that. That was a very comprehensive answer.
Admiral?
Yeah, I would only add to Ms. Conley's statement, in addition to the resources, I think another reason China's looking so hard at Greenland, at Iceland, Norway, they're looking for an eastern terminus for a transpolar route. We don't even think of a transpolar shipping route. We have, just like 9/11, we have a failure of imagination. We don't think about that ice-free, seasonal ice-free Arctic, or an ice-free Arctic with only, or an ice-covered Arctic, but with first-year sea ice, but with ships that can transit unassisted through that sea ice. They're looking at how to connect the Pacific and the Atlantic over the top. And, you know, sometimes we laugh at how they do it. It's a little clumsy from time to time, but less and less each day. So this is not only a twofer, but multiple things. Everything that Ms. Conley talked about, plus how do they control, how do they have first say in the strategic Atlantic port for the Arctic for that over-the-top route?
I think your answers to the question I raise make my point, is that China is a major player and is using its economic power and political power to influence the policies in the Arctic. I think that's underway. If I might, Mr. Chairman, we make our task is to make choices. We are in the process of choosing to spend $717 billion this year on the Department of Defense. If we took $1 billion of that, which is 1/13,000 of that money, $1 billion, and spent it on the Arctic. Just did a quick calculation here. We would have $700 million a year available to build icebreakers. In other words, we could build the 6 that are said to be required over the next decade. We could have $50 million a year for shore facilities for the Coast Guard and science. You have $50 million a year for communications, $50 million for domain awareness, $50 million a year for mapping, $50 million for research, and another 50 for whatever else you want to do. $1 billion of the $717 billion that we intend to spend on the Department of Defense this year. Food for thought. And that's why I asked each of you to put numbers and material and people, whatever, behind each of your recommendations. Because our task is to make choices. And talking to our colleagues here, we may very well want to do an Arctic strategy piece of legislation. I yield back.
Thank the ranking member.